Hi, and welcome to Decoding AQ, helping you to learn the tools, mindsets, and actions to thrive in an ever-changing world. Hi, and welcome to the next episode of Decoding AQ. With me today, I've got Lee Scott. He is the founder and chief change agent at Unleashing Leaders. And actually, I've been looking forward to hosting Lee on the show ever since we met 6 months ago at XPrize Visioneering. And we connected instantly. And I'm excited to learn more about his journey, the genesis of Unleashing Leaders, and share his wisdom with you all. So welcome to the show, Lee.
Great to be on it, Ross. Yes, it has been a long awaited. It's so glad we're doing it, brother.
Indeed. So as a little bit more background and build up to the awesomeness that is Lee, he's a prolific practitioner and educator of leadership, and he's significantly impacted both the public and private sectors. As I mentioned, he's the founder of Unleashing Leaders, and he's dedicated nearly 3 decades in inspiring leaders to more powerfully connect and contribute to their organizations and communities, and racking up maybe nearly 30,000, 26,000 professionals to date that have been through his coaching and training programs. And really, his approach integrates practical essentials for multiple disciplines and industries. So he helps cross-functional teams tackle daunting challenges, streamlining processes, and achieving quite remarkable results. So lots of experience, lots of background. And another thing I want to share with you before we go into the conversation
Oh,
is
now I'm scared.
I love his core values. And his core values are an acronym FIERCE. And that stands for freedom, integrity, excellence, resilience, curiosity, and engagement. So get ready to be inspired by Lee's practical insights and transformative strategies for unleashing leadership potential and fostering a culture of excellence and adaptability. So before we kick things off with a big question, did you ever save anyone's life while you were a lifeguard, Lee?
Yeah, definitely more than a few. Yeah, we pulled a few folks out of the water, and then I went on to be an ambulance EMT and pulled a few folks back from not having a pulse. So those are the ones you celebrate, and then there's the ones that you didn't, and you just know that you can't win them all, and you reminded of how precious life is. But yeah, I think the funniest one actually is one I thought I was saving, but they were actually totally fine. But like as I jumped off the tower, and my boss is standing right there, and I lost a flip flop on the way there, and I'm falling in the crevices of the lake, and I look like a dying goose trying to get to this kid. And then I finally get there, and then the kid was just splashing and playing, and he stands up and he's in waist deep water, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" And I'm like, just checking on you, man. I walked back, man. That was the longest walk of shame. My bosses and peers are all laughing at me. They're like, "Oh man, I'm glad you got after him, Lee." uh, so
It's really
embarrassing.
funny, isn't it, when how we respond to something. It's like a little stumble and, oh, yeah, I was just about to run. I was doing those things. And it's part of our biology, right? And maybe we can start there and tell me a little bit more about human biology and the connection to leadership and part of the genesis of Unleashing Leaders, Lee.
Yeah, Ross. I mean, this is so timely. But when I was initially contemplating creating Unleashing Leaders, it was about 1997, and was doing some work with like Capital One Bank and the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond, Virginia. And at the time, I was getting my degrees in biology and leadership, and I was seeing this massive parallelism between the two. And if you don't mind, kind of geeking out a little bit with your audience right now, Ross. I'm gonna go all biology science on you for a sec.
Not that I
um,
don't mind, is that I love it. And I know the
okay,
audience do. So let's geek out.
and then when I look at your AQ model, it's like it just matches up so well and has really, subliminally informed, all the practical models we've done. But if you understand the underlying science behind it, I think it helps you be more purposeful as a practitioner. But yeah, so my whole thesis was that leadership was a cultural manifestation of evolutionary adaptation, right? It was just, instead of being applied on, genetic and physical species, it was being applied on cultural means, and what were the priorities, and the complexities, and how organizations evolved and how individuals evolved. But the thing was, is as I was doing that, I realized how poorly understood some of the tenets of evolutionary biology even are. And that draws a lot of pop culture, misnomers. So as you kind of debunk those things and then you recode it, you actually see this beautiful roadmap for how leadership can really accelerate change. So for me, one of the biggest things is, when people think of evolution, the two words that most often come up is like, oh yeah, that's the natural selection, right? And it's only the strongest survive, and that's just not true. I mean, it's partially true, but it's not the whole truth, right? And so natural selection is an important part of that process, and that is for organizations and people too. And that's the part that says, there's some aspect or skill or competency or genetic, a code that confers some kind of advantage or favorability given a certain economic environment. So, and you can't say that absolutely, right? Like having more hair might be great in a cold climate, but having more hair might be terrible in a hot climate, for example, right? So it's always sensitive to those environmental conditions, but that's only one small part of it. And so when you look at the other dimensions, there's just a couple I'll mention here. One is, frankly, a little dose of luck, right? I mean, a baby turtle that comes out of that nest that has the best genotype that has ever existed, and it is just going to be an awesome sea turtle one day. If it just doesn't make that maiden run across the beach and gets picked off early on, that is game over, right? So it's a very, the natural selection is only one part of it. There's a little bit of dose of luck. Also, for a lot of animals, they might have a genetic predisposition to something, but they've got to build that behavior, and that takes trial and error. And so if you fail catastrophically on your first try, and you don't have resilience, you don't have the grit to be able to survive that learning stage, again, that genetic advantage does you really no good. So we see things like, yes, what are your underlying competencies and capabilities? Have you had the resilience and the grit to develop those behaviors over time? Does it fit with the natural environment and the market conditions around you? And is there a dose of luck? But even that's still only half. Altogether, that maybe is half of the whole equation. So the other half, and the part that doesn't get talked about a lot, is the importance of diversification and diversity, right? Because natural selection it can't purchase anything. It can't differentiate, well, that one's got a little more of this, on it and a little less of that on it, unless there was some engine driving diversity, right? If we didn't have a range of possibilities for that environment to select, then you wouldn't get any selection. It would just, stay the way it is. And I think that engine of diversification of the genotypes, the diversification of the mimetic types, right? The ideas that need to be shared in an organization, you need to have that divergence in order to then have the selective convergence to pull out what makes sense. And whether that's formulating your strategy, or developing your people, or identifying what talent composition you need, again, the importance of diversifying before you converge. I think a lot of leaders are very decisive, right? They want to converge, we got to get focused, and that's all true, but you got to allow both of those engines to work. One last thing, Ross, and I'll kind of end my monologue here. But the other misnomer that I think people have when they think about evolution in a biological context is they think it only has to do with the genes, right? And that's certainly an important mechanism. And that's a great vehicle for transferring information. And we're going to look at a parallel with that when we talk about AI and blockchain later, right? But that's not the only mechanism, even biology. So there's this thing called extragenetic inheritance, is kind of the fancy word for it. But it's advantages that you inherit that aren't necessarily through the embryo that you were. And so an example of that might be, having parents, of offspring that take a little bit more time and energy, right, to cultivate and protect you in those vulnerable stages, right? That's not the genes helping you, that's the parents helping you. But even in animals where, they just drop you off and that's it, right? You're on your luck, you're on your own, kid. But that crocodile having chosen to be in that part of the mangrove swamp that's a little more protected from the storms, right? That's not a genetic advantage, that's a geographical advantage. And because your parents happen to be there and your ancestors happen to be there, that can confer an advantage versus somebody else who's got the best genes in the world, but is on a very exposed part of the coast. And you see that today when we look at social systems and the inequities that show up between somebody being born in one zip code versus another zip code, right? So I think as leaders, the parallels are just so powerful in being able to say, yes, it does have to do with certain internal competencies. It also has to do with the natural environment that you're working in. It has to do a little bit with luck. It has to do with resilience. And it also has to do with that extra genetic things, the support that helps cultivate you being able to survive those first vulnerable rounds to really have the impact as a leader. And when you overlay that with your AQ model, it's like an 85% match, Ross. I was just like, oh my God, this is scientific validation, dude. So, anyways, I thought that might be interesting to kind of reflect on.
Definitely. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's still very much, we're complex in ourselves, and let alone then the multiplication factor when we add multiple versions of ourselves in a
Yeah.
team,
Yeah.
and then have the multiplication of geopolitical, science, geography, all of these things, these environmental factors that can then influence our thinking, our, principles, our values, our decision making, and even our ability, where you mentioned about, to diverge and converge, and this powerful piece of divergence coming from diversity of,
Yes.
geography, thought, upbringing, background, epigenetics, whatever all of those things are, and our real ability to see beyond ourselves. Because I think many people like to think we're pretty diverse in our thinking, but actually most of us are pretty tunnel visioned, right?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
hang out with the same people. We do the same things most days, get out of bed on the same side, brush our teeth in the same way, shower in the same way, have our same breakfast within maybe two or three types of breakfast that we might eat, and
And
go
we
on,
have to, right? That's
go
the
on
only way.
repeat.
We don't have the caloric capacity to be reinventing all those things every day, right? We have to find shortcuts, but then those shortcuts become traps and blind spots, or in our cases, leashes, right? That keep you from being able to unleash that full potential.
And it's those, habits that then form attitudes, that form a mood, that then form actually a personality for many of
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And I think the opportunity that we have together with the challenge is the requirement of this shift. You talk about change, accelerating the changes you seek. Now, change can show up in a couple of ways, right? It can be the change I seek or the change that chooses me, whether
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
seek it or
And
not.
I'm seeking to survive the best of a bad situation. Yeah.
Yeah. And so talk to me a little bit about some of the experiences that you're seeing at the moment for leaders that, there's intentionality, right, between the words unleashing, between accelerating and changes. And talk to me about the context of what you're seeing right now, of some of the challenges, some of the opportunities that leaders are going through around the speed, around the pressures, around the opportunities. Just give us a little context setting of what you're seeing and who you're working with.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned several really important variables, and your prior guests have really gone in well into those about the speed of it and the complexities of it. A piece that I want to highlight in addition to those is just the sheer overwhelm of it, and how we're taking for granted, what these humans can do, and the conditions that they've been given to thrive in, right? And so often, I mean, let's take a healthcare example, because we do a lot of work in healthcare. But you have somebody who's a clinical practitioner, right? They were an RN, they were a cardiothoracic surgeon, they were a pediatrician, whatever, right? So these are not dumb people, right? Were smart, they were trained, they are incredibly knowledgeable. In an engineering firm, right? You have somebody that is, they're a licensed engineer. They solve really complex problems. They can do math like nobody else, right? So these are really intelligent people who find themselves in leadership positions. And then there's this sea change, right? There's a market shift, there's a legislative change, there is a policy shift, there's a turnover of the executive suite, and they have a brand new direction they want to go in. And now they're responsible for implementing some policy or technology or programmatic change. And the assumption is, because you're smart, therefore you know how to do this, or because you have subject matter expertise even in the thing, right? Like, you know all about the clinical aspects of this technological platform. Therefore, you should be able to run $100 million program that's implementing this brand new thing that's never been done before anywhere in the world. And that assumption, Ross, is so ludicrous. And it sets so many leaders up. Oh, and by the way, you have to continue to run your current function while you're leading this transformational, enterprise-wide effort. You have a line of business or a profit and loss center, or you've got this program you're overseeing. So this is a side hustle for you. So in the 2 hours a day, for the first time you've ever seen this in your life, for something that would crush any normal human, they're being expected to step up to these conditions. And I think yes, they're great people. Yes, they're smart. They even have all the potential for it, but it is not fair and it's not nice. And I think that is burning a lot of really effective leaders out. And I think it's also making other people who could be great leaders say, I don't want any part of that. So we're shrinking the workforce and the labor market of people who really could be great leaders. And God knows we need as many of them fighting it as we possibly can these days. So I think that's something that doesn't get addressed enough.
So how do we deal with that, Lee? Is that a expectation reset, or is that a health approach to equip those people to achieve it?
I
Whether
think
that's
both.
space, training, whatever it is. Give me a view of that blend.
Yeah, I think the expectation is just like, again, most people will see maybe one, sometimes two on the outside, three major transformational changes or implementations, in their careers, right? Most of the time it is, supporting maintenance incremental. And that's totally normal. So the idea that, well, just because you're good at X, therefore you're good at something completely unrelated to X is I think that's the expectation reset to say there is going to be a learning curve, and just because you're smart in one context doesn't mean you have the skills in another context. I mean, I would not take somebody who is an amazing violinist and say, wow, you're so good at violin, we're making you the swim team captain. You're like, those don't have anything to do with each other. It's like, well, no, I mean, there's your mastery, your skill, you practice, right? It's the same difference. And so I think that's the expectation set. I think on the health side is making sure that they have the support, those extra genetic inheritance, right? That, yes, they've got good competencies. Yes, they've got good capabilities. But what are we doing to surround them with, in some cases it might be a small dose, in other cases it might be a heavy dose, in some cases they need somebody to run alongside for a period of time to have, because we also don't have the luxury of taking time to coach them from 0 to 60, right? It's like, this does need to get done now. The market is not, that clock is ticking. So what we find here is what leaders benefit most from is a blend of support. And so it might range from some facilitation to clarify the strategic intent so we can focus more effectively, some coaching maybe to give them some therapeutic bouncing back and resilience when they take those initial hits, all the way to, and what's really worked well for us is having, a fractional leadership team or a turnkey team of people who they've done this 10 times in their careers, right? And let them partner with you, run in parallel for a little while, get you over the first hump so that they have a chance to come up to speed. And then we can transition that over to them to sustain and continue on, hence the name Unleashing Leaders. And that's different than, we'll just do it for you, and at the end we'll throw it over with some documentation. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about mentorship and delivery in parallel. And that's something that's kind of unique, I think, in our industry.
And you mentioned parallel there in terms of right at the beginning of, hey, it's either your day job or your side hustle is transformation, or in terms of, it's not just done and you didn't know what was going on in that black box and then off we move on. Is that
Yeah.
duality of being able to upskill them for that by the
Hmm.
blend of maybe people who've done it before, or maybe it's just the seasonality of their depletion.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
need rest
Hmm.
before go. Uh,
Hmm.
and often what I've certainly seen, I don't know if you've seen it, is that people create an identity for themselves from their past, right? We get an applause. Well done. Oh, you listened well. Oh, you spoke well, so you speak more, or you do this, or you led that project well. Well done, Lee. Do it again, do it again, do it again. And that comes back to this expectation. If you want something done, give it a busy person,
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then if you're doing it and you take that on, you've layered and compounded this expectation of
yeah,
expertise means delivery, experience means delivery, time in the job means de-risked, more likely to achieve the outcome. Whereas the opposite might be true when what we
yeah,
need now is experimentation, new
yeah.
things, an entirely new way
Diversity.
of thinking, and the
There.
divergence.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we're about to enter an interesting phase of transition in terms of generations that are working at the same time in same organizations, 4 or 5 generations, different
Hmm.
cultures, different thinking, and also a leadership shift of who now are the leaders and how they've been exposed to what might have been austerity or war or different things of what they, whether it's technological, cultural aspects. And I'm curious at the life cycle of leadership
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
adaptation during the unleashing, maybe the early ones, people in it, and then the exiting ones,
Yep.
perhaps their next fractional roles or their portfolio careers or those things. What's been some of the insights that you've seen of the moments of change at the life cycle of leadership?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that, Lee.
Well, I mean, when you talk about the life cycle, then when you measure that, we call it the half-life of leadership, right? So because you're you are radiating, right? And if you're radiating, it's, you're depleting, that underlying resource of energy. And if you're doing it right, you're taking risk with those experimentations and you're being disruptive. And over time, you just build up people who threw slings and arrows at you, and that is part of the process. And then you're right, you get celebrated for these heroic efforts, you're burning the candles at both ends, and then there's just not as much to go around. So great articulation of that pattern, Ross. What I've found is the most successful mega transformational efforts, right? Whether it's energy, healthcare, education, construction, engineering, whatever, is when exactly what you just said. There is a respect across the generations of leaders, and there's not what we call role inversion. So, you've got that sponsor, maybe it's on the C-suite or up there, they've seen this 2 or 3 times, they've got some contextual expertise and knowledge. They're trying to drive on that. Okay. The role inversion is when they try to become the project manager, right? And they try to become the analyst and the architect and the change manager and all of those things. And it's like, now, yes, your knowledge is valuable, but now it has become a liability. Right. But when they partner effectively, and we're seeing this with a client right now, where this amazing gentleman, he's going to be on my podcast. We're recording him tomorrow. I won't say his name, but this amazing leader, has been around there, has been there, done that. He's been intentionally selecting people in the organization that are kind of early to mid career, and he's bringing them up a little faster than normal so that they're in that mid range, and they've got some real competencies around execution or design or analytical thinking or whatever that piece is. And so then he's partnering with them and he allows them to, and he's not overly prescriptive. He really embraces this curious. He's like, I wonder, let's think about this. What are the strategic implications? Who might we want to talk about? Now, in his mind, he is crystal freaking clear what needs to happen, but he's smart enough to kind of hold that back a little bit to create the space for that diversity of thoughts, and allows people to struggle a little bit, not a lot, right? So they're not getting frustrated, but they have a chance to kind of chew on it and wrestle with it, right? And then there's a third layer, and in this case, it's some folks who are fresh out of graduate school or maybe even undergrad, and very, very early, very bright-eyed and bush-tailed, tons of energy, not well channeled, not real sophisticated, but will just get after it, right? And then they get delegated again. Here's the outcome. You now go wrestle with the implementation of it, and that brings that the energetic and the diversity of thought from that newest generation with the maturity, the focus, and the discipline, but maybe not as much energy and maybe not as diversity of thought with that season. and now you have multi-generational collaboration going on. And I think leaders that partner as a team, I like to say leadership's a team sport, right?
Mm.
It's not one big C-suite executive just driving the drum. It is truly, alignment vertically in the organization at all levels. And it doesn't have to be everybody, but if you get a right couple of people at each of those spots, then you get to harness that energy.
I had a few visuals going on in my mind there, Lee, as you were talking about, of perhaps as leadership is shifting from the, period of utilize and improve, maintain efficiency, productivity, maximize the gains,
All
to
convergence, right?
to
Converge,
converging
converge.
now to where there are new areas where humility is required,
Yeah.
where what
Curiosity,
what
humility.
you said of was an advantage before is actually now potentially the very ball and chain from the
Yeah.
next opportunity, and that unlearning that needs to take place. And I had this visual of um the inversion of the pyramid with the leader at the bottom, because often we see, the leader is the person at the front and we lead them, and we see that throughout history, throughout, you only have to watch a Hollywood movie to see that, Braveheart, all these people, the leaders are the ones at the
Yeah.
front. And then when we think about it, of the humble leaders, the wolf at the back of the pack, the,
Yeah. A level five.
leader
Yeah.
who, a level 5 leader, yeah, who's able to partner with others and actually give them the space to surprise everybody with what
Hmm.
was possible, to
Hmm.
to be humble enough that maybe we don't have all the answers, just because we've had history and
Yeah.
we've had experience, and to be able to say, we've moved from playing the violin to being in a swimming pool, we've moved from this environmental context, this political
Yeah.
landscape, this technological landscape, to this one. What does the new things now represent? And I think, when leaders are able to do that, it's an interesting one. Yet they feel a sense of, I remember one conversation very recently where they were responsible for communicating a return to office mandate across an organization of over 100,000 employees. And they were genuinely concerned about how that would land,
Hmm.
and hadn't got their own stuff figured out, but felt they had to have their stuff figured out before they could communicate it. And I offered the opportunity for them to rethink and say, would it be okay for you not to have it figured out,
Yeah.
and allow others to help you figure it out, and
Yeah.
that's okay too?
Invite them into that space with you.
Yeah. And I
Create.
wonder, what your view of, if we look now, not too far in the future, a year, the
Mm.
next year, what people are dealing with, what we're facing, and these impacts, the projects that you're working on. I know that you're just landing several very large, wide scoped, important projects with big important mandates. What are some of the techniques, what are some of the thinkings, what are the strategies that you're looking to implement there, that perhaps some of our listeners could take some inspiration from?
Yeah, for sure. I want to give you some of those practical tools as well. Before I answer that question, though, Ross, I want to just comment. You talk about having a visual of that, and for your listeners that are auditory only, right? That's why our logo with Unleashing Leaders is the way that it is. So, for your listeners, it's a diamond, and the idea is that inverted org chart, right? The leader as a servant is at the bottom, right, and then our logo is stretching out and above. But you have a red and a blue version of the U and the L, right? And the red is that, diversity of thought, experimentation, novel pioneering. And then the blue is the discipline, cultivating, prioritizing, you know, all of which,
And the
but it's also kind of
duality,
like the
that,
hands, right? And the duality of it.
yeah,
So
beautiful.
when you said a visual, I'm like, well, that's the visual, man.
I like it.
uh, but yes, in terms of what's on the immediate horizon, we're really still, I think, at the very beginning of the adoption of data-driven tools, informatics, analytics that are really meant to supplement human assessment of situations at large scales, whether it's serving clients in a retail setting, patients in a clinical setting, residents in a community setting, right? We're dealing now with, population scale types of projects and challenges. And Ronald Heifetz, who wrote the book Leadership Without Easy Answers, kind of what you were talking about there. He describes those three types of leadership challenges. And type one is, it's a known problem with a known solution, right? Take two of these, see me in the morning. Type two is, we're clear about what the problem is, but we really don't know what the solution is. So that's more of that, innovate and invent, your way to come up with a solution. And many people will see that multiple times in their career. But type three problems are ones where we're not quite sure exactly what the problem is, and we sure as heck don't know what the solutions are. I think more and more we're going to be seeing, and we're already seeing it, like the return to the office compounded with major social unrest and dynamics, with weird economic conditions that don't normally go together, right? Like usually you see this or you see this, you don't see all of them at the same time. So to your point, somebody who has too much history and says, well, I know what that looks like, just take two of these, you are misdiagnosing the problem. This is not a type one, this is a type three. And in that case, that humility and that curiosity to be open to co-creating solutions means you've got to be vulnerable and admit you don't have all the answers. And that's a little scary, but it's also cathartic, because guess what? We never did think you had the answers. And those who thought they did have the answers, we all thought they were a bunch of asses, So it's actually like relieving. So that's just a little bit about, that reframing that says this is going to take a different kind of leadership. So what I'm seeing across the board is really smart people who are used to using their own eyes and their own immediate data sets and lived experience to inform prioritization and policy decisions, to how do you use informatics and analytics and data in radically new ways. And AI is going to just completely explode all of that, because it's going to do a lot of that massive digestion of lots of information that no human could ever possibly get access to, and be able to distill out some insights around, well, this is how this program's actually working. This is what your customers really want. This is what your competitors are doing that's very different than you. And I think that scares a lot of people. But I think what leaders, if they can start to embrace that this is going to be uncertain, but it's actually going to help me do some of that laborious, digestive, calculations, then we get to focus on the creative part of saying, now what are we going to do with it? And the emotional part, now how do we get people engaged and seeing this and seeing how it's relevant to the customer impact or the mission or the profit or whatever that company's going after. I think that's what we're seeing in the next year, is a lot of leaders getting some one-on-one schooling in that exact environment. I'll go on to some tools after that, but I want to pause and let you breathe.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, where we've had these waves of opportunity to help us do better, to do
Mhm.
more, right? To do better decision making, to reach those that can't be reached, to serve those that we want to serve, to be a hero in new and unique ways. And often, creativity comes from pressure, right? It comes from those challenges.
Almost always, yeah.
And yet, the space required to be creative needs play, needs
Yeah.
that, duality again of specificity. So we know what we're dealing with. We need an element of pressure of time, but we need to be in a state that allows us to cognitively compute different things, rather than all of that is turned off because we're just functioning in a state of overwhelm, stress, so much things. And AI can feel like that a lot of times, right? Here's another project, here's another thing. Oh, AI will do all of this. It'll digest loads of stuff.
Mhm.
Versus, I can't even breathe yet.
Yeah.
Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. And I'm curious of what this looks like on the ground, where there's, these cycles of innovation, of change, of transformation. They happen, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
They happen under pressure. They happen with a time and with importance. It might be a life-threatening importance.
Yep.
It could be, all sorts of aspects of the perspective of importance. how might, first question, is creativity and play important for leaders? And if it is, how do you do that when everything around you is not inducive
Yeah.
of play and creativity, yet that's one of the things that we may prize? So do we prize it? Is that helpful? And if it is, how do we do it when it's hard?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it goes back to, again, that evolution needs both the play and the diversification, and the gnarly tooth and claw part of the natural selection. You have to have both. I think the trick is if you try to do both at the same time, it doesn't work. Right. And so I think, to me, it's just all about having the discipline to make a conscious choice to say, hey, we're going to carve out some time to allow for that diversity of thought, allow for that experimentation, allow for that playing. That's one. I think the other piece of it is, and we've learned this, 25, 30 years ago, but not doing it big bang. The idea, it's like, okay, this is an uncertain thing that's never been done before. Let's make a super custom, bespoke, one of a kind solution and then throw it all out at once. That just, the book, How Big Things Get Done, right? It's like, the folly of that has been demonstrated over and over and over again. But if you slice it, using your agile frameworks and the like, but slice your implementations into smaller iterations, then you can be like, let's play and experiment a little bit, but in a smaller scope space. Right, try some things on, learn some things. Okay, now let's do the next one. Now let's do the next one. Now learning has a chance to compound, right? And actually, it accelerates the change because you are getting that compound interest that's happening versus delay, 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 delay until we have everything's known, everything's perfect. We know every angle of this. Now we can do it with a slam dunk. You're like, well, A, that'll never happen in these type 3 problems. And B, the market will crush you before you get there. Right. So I think having the discipline and then scoping things in a more iterative fashion, both of those will play to a leader's advantage. And for us, it's not that there's not a lack of tools out there. There's all these great methodologies and tricks and tools. One of the things that we're finding has really been helpful is how to help leaders know when to use which tool and in the toolbox, right? And you don't even have to be an expert in it, just but the right tool at the right time in the hands of a decently trained amateur will go a lot further than the wrong tool at the wrong time in the hands of a master. And so what we've done is we've created this thing called VOPAR, and it explicitly describes those breathing in and breathing out components. And that helped, like, my 19-year-old daughter was visiting over the weekend, right? She's struggling and overwhelmed with career choices and, boyfriend breakups and, mommy issues and all those things, right? And I'm like, I taught you VOPAR, use it, right? And we walked through it and she's like, oh my gosh, that took all this overwhelm and complexity. And now I've got a clear path. I'm doing the exact same as the director of a 12,000 employee organization with a psychiatric hospital network. It's just, it's the sequencing of the tools will accelerate the change even more than specific mastery of any one tool. So if you'd like, we can chat a little bit about that breathing in and
Tell me
breathing
what
out.
VOPAR is, and yeah, give me what that is and how that looks with a story. Either it can be your own, where you've used it yourself, or
Mhm.
using it within a context of a company.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll use a project. We're implementing some technology that's going to, automate some information analysis and things of that nature, right? So, I'll use that generically because that's kind of a hybrid of like 8 different stories. That way, I'm not giving away any client specific information. Um, uh, so VOPAR stands for, it's an acronym, right? So visualize, organize, prioritize, actualize, revise. And this is not out of any book, right? I guess at one point I need to write the book, but it's stitching together the hundreds of books and all the hours of training and development and implementation experience. But each one has like a yin and a yang, right? That's that breathing in, breathing out. So with Visualize, the breathing in is to say, let's, before we jump to stating what our strategic priorities and imperatives are, let's take a moment to breathe in. What are the divergent trends that are hitting us right now? And rather than trying to identify what the future will be, let's imagine 5 or 6 different futures, right? So let's look at a couple different possibilities. What if inflation stays the same? What if inflation goes down? What if inflation goes really, really high? What if legislation is supportive? What if legislation is hostile? What if the market is receptive? What if a customer be? So it's like, like you're like, but which one is it? And you're like, don't know. Ray Dalio is a brilliant, wealth manager, because he's like, I don't predict what the future is going to be. I just plan for red and black and proportions that are, typical. So having that breathing in to look at different scenarios of what might hit us, and then having a conversation says, okay, we think this one's a little more likely, but that's an outside chance. But then if you look at both of those scenarios and there's some common actions and a position you want to play in regardless, well, then that's your strategy, right? Instead of you trying to guess the future, you can actually predict it and see it, by looking at the commonalities across multiple futures. So then you get, now when you have their traditional, what's our strategic goals, what are objectives, what are our key results, whatever that framework you want to use, you're now doing it in a context of possibilities versus, assuming it's only one, and then if you're wrong, you're hosed. So that's kind of the, again, a sequencing of it. Don't start with your goals and objectives, start with your landscape. Then for the organized step, it's like, okay, let's breathe in with an inventory of what are both the resources that we currently have at our disposal, right? Well, we have this knowledge set, we have this population, we have this market share, we have this whatever, and then also what are the risks, right? Right now we're vulnerable here. Right now we have some serious threats. We have a looming deadline. We have budget pressures. We have a shortage of X. So, a lot of folks don't want to look at those things because they're scary. And it makes you, not want to do the thing that you're trying to do. But I'm not saying but look fear in the eye. It's kind of like, I always go back to the Aliens movies series, right? In the first Aliens, it was terrifying because you never actually saw the monster. But like Aliens 4, you're like, it's a pet. You want to put a poster on your wall and it's totally cool, right? So if you look the fear in the eye and you're like, okay, I'm getting organized around what resources I have and what risks I have, then I can distill out of that and say, all right, well, based on that, here is our services that we're currently offering, and here are the major changes we want to make to those services. That's very responsive to those things. Now you're talking about service portfolio, project portfolio, those tools, to, create an inventory of what you want and why you think you want it now and what resources you have to play with it. And, now you can see what's on your plate, because it's if you can't see what's on your plate, the sense of overwhelm is huge. Now, when you look at what's all on your plate, you very quickly come to the conclusion you probably don't have all the resources to do all of those things right now. And that's where the prioritization comes in. So, then you can say, all right, I can now prioritize, but rather than me picking a priority out of my head, or what a lot of leaders do, everything's a priority, which means nothing's a priority. We can literally say, like, there are 10 things that are relevant that we could be doing right now. Let's make some trade-off and some force ranking discussions to say, okay, that's important and that's important. But if I only had to choose one of those, this one takes the cake. Then you can allocate or actualize your resources and say, all right, we're going to delegate a specific leader with these resources for this amount of time. And we're going to take the hit on pulling them off of this existing service work, right? And yeah, that KPI is going to go in the toilet, but it's okay that it's going in the toilet, because this whole thing is going to go in the toilet if we don't change. And now you have the space for these people to execute. And now you can do your project management and all those other types of disciplines. So but if you do it in that order, right, visualize, assess the landscape, articulate where you want to play in that, organize what resources you have, what are your options for deploying those, prioritize, actualize. And the trick with actualize is the most scarce resource that exists in almost any organization. It's not your finances, it's not your technology, it's not your data, it's not your facilities. It is a person with the right leadership skills for that problem. And we often have two or three of them in any organization, and we load them up, and it's like, nope, it's time for somebody fresh to step into that. Ross is now ready for this one. So that's that actualize step. And then the revise step is knowing that this is always flawed. Assess some progress, right? Do an increment of something, get some feedback, get some measures, talk to some customers, talk to your people, and then adapt, regularly to say, what, we got the wrong priorities, we assigned the wrong resources, we didn't assess the right risks. And that gives you an order of operations to apply the right tool at the right time, versus being like, I don't know, what should we do? I've done a balanced scorecard, let's do that. Or, hey, project management sounds good, we should do some of that. Let's do an assessment. Sure, why not? More surveys will probably solve it. then we're just throwing tools at it instead of being deliberate to allow for that breathing in and breathing out.
I think that's a beautiful structure, like you say, of sequencing. And what also comes to my mind alongside that is, how are the people showing up when they go there? And I think about when I go to the supermarket, and I go to the supermarket when I'm hungry versus after I've had a big meal, right? My shopping looks
Mhm.
different. So I could go through that process in different ways, depending on my mindset, the context, if we had a good quarter, bad year, great year, whatever it may be. And also historically, it would be, oh, okay, let's do that 2, 3 years, let's plan that out. And we might take a look every year type piece.
Yeah, yeah.
Versus the reality now that not only do we need
All
to do it more
micro.
frequent and have that
Yeah.
feedback loop, but we
Mhm.
need to, as best we can, have the diversity of mindset that some people go there with abundance. They've had
Yep.
their meal and they're full. And so they
Yep.
don't need to buy all the things on offer and at the end aisles. And others who have been on a 48-hour fast, who see everything and want it all. And be
Mhm.
able to bring that to those sessions and celebrate those different ways. And for an organization in their sustainability and health to have that rhythm, have that seasonality, and
Yep.
set that agenda maybe,
Mhm.
depending on, okay, when we've done this landscape, what is it? Are we hungry? Or are we actually we're fed? And therefore, that gives us a different context for when we're forcing decisions, when we're cutting things off, when we're saying no as to why, and where will it intercept in those S curves? Where will it intercept with the next
Yeah.
propositions, the next pieces within the market? And from that sense of, you know, inner confidence. I think leaders, one of the biggest things that I've certainly found from my own coach, from Dan Sullivan, is, the number one thing for entrepreneurs is protect your confidence.
Mhm. Mhm.
All things you face, you will face them. There will be good, there'll be bad, there'll be all of
Yep.
those things.
There'll be
But you
all those merit
bring
badges.
it
Yep.
with that sense that this is solvable. I might not know how right now, I might not know who, but
Mhm.
I believe it's possible. I believe that it's possible. And as
Yeah.
we,
Well, that's where hope is both the first ingredient and it's the most important outcome.
mm,
Right. And these are skills that are learnable, and teachable and applicable. They're not terribly hard. You don't need the most sophisticated versions of it to be successful with it. But to your point, as an organization, if you're really so beat up that you as a leader can't model that possibility, then that's where having a mentor, a facilitator, a coach comes in handy.
yeah,
And we can bring that objectivity,
get
that
outside
freshness.
yourself,
Yeah.
go and, whatever it needs to be in order for you to shift your perspective. And it's
Yeah.
not because of the situation, it's because of the way you see the situation.
It's your
Uh,
choices and how you look and frame
yeah.
it.
And I
And
think that's where a lot of transitions are coming right now. I think where it was operational leadership of delivery of known things to
yes,
now leadership supporting
pioneering and humaning.
the human side, the coaching, the how do you make sure that that person has life, has vitality, has health, can breathe, is not in dis-ease
Yeah.
functionally in their biology to come full circle to be able to show up in those ways. As we come
Well,
to
Ross,
the witching
just
hour, Lee, do you want to reflect just quickly on there? And then I've got a few final pieces to touch on.
yeah. I was just going to say one last thing is I also think member selection for those conversations, whether you're doing it, quarterly, monthly, whatever, back to what we mentioned earlier, oftentimes, it's like, hey, it's just going to be the three most senior executive, most knowledgeable people. And again, have those visualization, organization, and prioritization conversations include some of your frontline people in that. Doesn't need to be everybody, right? But and they're like, well, that's overwhelming. It's like, well, then just facilitate it well. Like, I mean, that's not the hard part to solve, but that also injects that fresh energy and that sense of possibility into those conversations, and then they get exposed to it. I mean, I remember a point in my career where I was facilitating the strategic plan for this $2 billion company, and planning the offsite and the executives, and I had been in it to win it, the thick of it, and then the day for the event came, and then the CEO was like, "Yeah, Lee, we're good, we got it, you don't need to come." and it was so deflating. And it was like, look, I'm not there to try to dominate the conversation. Like I sit in the corner, but like this is my chance to learn and to see whether what I just did worked or not, right? And it was like, well, that's not very efficient. You just stay back at the office and run things, while we go have this offsite with all the graybeards. And so now that I am a graybeard, I'm very intentional to like get those fresh eyes and those line level leaders involved in the formulation of your strategy, not just the execution of it. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, that sense of how are they involved? How do they facilitate? Are they involved the whole time? Not. One of the things that has worked interestingly well with sessions that we've run is right at the beginning when you're doing the landscaping, when you're getting that initial data in, when you're involving them, is we've done it where we've got all of those senior graybeards and experienced people to take the persona of a journalist.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
in that
Oh,
beginning,
that's great.
as a journalist, they then have to conduct short interviews of each of
Mhm.
those people. So they're the ones with the information, with the story, with the knowledge, with the experience. Your job is to ask great questions and document that. So when you're, someone speaking to and we've literally had, the dozen or so most senior people have to sit there. One of them for the next 15 minutes is the interviewer. Everyone else is journalists. You have to write down what you hear, what you say. Right. You're looking for body language. You're looking for what wasn't said. You're looking for this. You're looking for this. And you give everyone these roles.
Yeah.
And it's incredible what they then distill out because
Mm.
they're taking a different persona from that. And then the next person, right, who's interviewing this one, who's interviewing this one. What normally happens is we're going to sit back and judge them while they present some information.
Yeah.
And I'll judge whether that information, I hear it, it resonates, I've seen it before, or I know it.
Mm.
Very different
Mm.
attitude and mindset when you just reposition that at the early stage. So that's just one thing that I've loved to play with that, and I found those senior leaders really enjoy doing it.
Yeah.
It gives
Yeah.
them just a relief from having to make decisions and judge, and they can be curious again, they can be
Yeah.
playful again,
Well,
and
you're allowing them to step out of their normal
yeah,
phase, and those types of activities. A really good facilitator helps bring those to the table,
absolutely.
right? And it makes it fun again. I mean, that's the feedback when we facilitate a conversation. Again, we're boots on the ground making it
Mm.
happen. That's 90% of our work. But when we're in that facilitator mode, the feedback we love when they say, "Hey, that was really fun," and you're like, "And we were laughing and we were having a good time." And you're like, okay, that means you now have the emotional space to create.
Yeah. Yeah. Joe Polish has an acronym, ELF businesses, easy, lucrative, and fun, rather than, I think the other one was hard. Forget what the acronym, I'll have to find that out and I'll put it on the show notes. So as
Okay.
we come to the last piece, this is a question, it's a two-part question that I've asked every guest at the end of every episode, and I'm sure it's going to make a book at some point. And it's related to curiosity, and I know that is one of your core values in your fierce acronym, and it's linked to doing new things. So it's,
Mhm.
when was the last time you did something for the first time, and what was it?
Oh my gosh. Well, as a curiosity addict, Curious George was my favorite stuffed animal growing up as a kid. So this was truly embedded from the get-go. I'm only truly comfortable when I'm uncomfortable, and I think that has kind of been a part of my story arc. So most recently, we in the last year we made a decision to shift to having a hobby farm. And never raised cattle before, never raised rabbits. We've had chickens before, but ducks and goats and the whole nine yards. And so I've got some Midwestern in the U.S. Roots, and I wanted my children to have an appreciation for where food comes from, and being sustainable, and just as much intellectual work as you and I do, Ross, being able to get out there and work the land and do that. So yeah, I am, a part-time farmer. Was fighting with the irrigation pump yesterday. Got the technicians out there, and we're wrenching on it. And this is this guy's expertise, but it's not working. And so we're figuring that out. And we had a baby cow, just this last spring, and been raising her up and learning how all the things that go into raising all of these animals and good
Animal
husbandry
husbandry. Yeah.
and all the setbacks and the heartaches and that one got this disease or that one got injured and having to do the hard choices to
Mm,
gracefully cull them out and but I'm like, look, I'm not just going to eat this food. Like, I'm going to make sure that I put energetic love into it. So
yeah.
yeah, so I am a farmer now, Ross, and uh
Beautiful.
not at scale, but and I'm making all of the stupid new farmer mistakes, and I love it.
Isn't that wonderful? And for all of us to love the mistakes.
Yeah,
And actually, those mistakes are often the most beautiful pieces, not only because of the learning, but the perspective it gives us, the
yeah.
little jab in the ribs,
Mhm.
to just reset us, to ground us. And no matter what we face, do it with energy, do it with love, do it with compassion, do it with a smile. And
Yeah.
the instant connection I had with you, Lee, 6 months ago when we met, and just the journey that we've been on, I'm looking forward to many of those moments of mistakes, of learning, of
Yeah.
smiles, of celebrations, and everything in between. I
Yeah.
wish you and your family, great joy in that. And for us, some collaboration. I know that we're going to do some great work together. It's been an absolute joy. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way that they can do that at Unleashing Leaders? And Lee, how do they get in touch with you, Lee?
Yeah, Ross. So love to stay connected and build that community, and absolutely did what you just said about the co-creation that we're going to be able to do together on different sides of the Atlantic, my friend. But yeah, probably the best place for us is LinkedIn. We've got Unleashing Leaders out there. We've got our podcast, the Unleashing Leaders podcast, which I know I'm going to look forward to having you as a guest on that show. Little newer to that. That's also a new thing that I've done recently. So that was going to be my other answer, but that seemed too self-centered. But those are two great places. And then, of course, unleashingleaders.com is our main website. And if they want to follow me personally, I'm also on LinkedIn, Lee Allen Scott on LinkedIn.
Beautiful. Thank you, Lee. It's been an absolute pleasure to hang out live on the show together, and look forward to many more conversations to come.
Hey, let's change this world, my friend.
Do you have the level of adaptability to survive and thrive the rapid changes ahead? Has your resilience got more comeback than a yo-yo? Do you have the ability to unlearn in order to reskill, upskill and break through? Find out today and uncover your adaptability profile and score, your AQ. Visit AQai.io to gain your personalized report across 15 scientifically validated dimensions of adaptability. For a limited time, enter code PODCAST65 for a complimentary AQ assessment. AQai, transforming the way people, teams and organizations navigate change. Thank you for listening to this episode of Decoding AQ. Please make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast directory, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Please do leave a review and be sure to tune in next time for more insights from our amazing guests.